You don't count. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first session of the day on marketing in Web3 in the Metaverse from the RRD workshop. And to introduce our moderator for this panel discussion, we have Mr. Rolando Zubiran, Global Head Web3 and Metaverse Services for RRD Go Creative. Let's give him a warm hand of applause, Mr. Zubiran. How are you? Okay, please have a seat. Next, we have Mr. Hervé Laren, CEO of Hervé.io. Welcome, Hervé. Hervé, mais je suis francophone. All right. And next, this... Okay, I won't say it. Mr. Sarkis, did you know that you have an Armenian name? Have you been told this? Mr. Karim Sarkis, Partner, Media and Entertainment at Strategy and... Welcome, sir. And last but not least, Mr. Carl Place, founder of iAdvisory. Welcome, gentlemen. Have a lovely time. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. And thank you for your morning energy. Thank you very much. We all needed that. No. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for our group. I hope we're going to have a very, very good discussion on marketing and the metaverse. I think it's always important to frame a little bit the concepts about, obviously, what is the metaverse? Is it a true technological revolution? What are the actual parameters or the scope of what the metaverse is? And I think we're going to have a good discussion because we have what I'm going to try to categorize without actually framing you in the box, a couple of profiles. No, we're going to have a little bit of a, I would call it an evangelist perspective, no, very fashion forward. We're going to have more of a pragmatist, no, realist approach on what the metaverse is, and I hope Strategy and will represent here. And we're going to have a little bit of the technology side of the perspective also, no? The vision of how this applies to multiple industries and how this can transcend maybe even from the technology slide economic perspective. No, so it's a pleasure to have this diversity here. Framing the concept, no, is the metaverse actually a true technological revolution? Will it actually disrupt markets? Will it actually enable for new social interaction? What is this new experience internet, no? This new era of connection. So I would just like for you to start framing a little bit the discussion, and then we'll go into marketing. Hervé, what do you think about the metaverse? What is that punchline, no?
Yeah, so thank you, Rolando. So I think it's interesting about the concept of the metaverse to look a little bit about the history. The first time that concept came to life was in the book Snow Crash, the Neil Stephenson book, and that was in the 1990s. That was the first time that it was actually mentioned. And when you fast forward, the first time that I got involved with the metaverse was with the ICO in Decentraland in 2017, which was for me a little bit of an eye opener of what could be the future. And at first it was to buy tokens, believing in the vision, and afterwards helping landowners develop their business models. When we look at today the metaverse with the different events that had happened over the last year or so, I have my own definition. And my definition of the metaverse is when your digital life becomes more valuable than your physical life. And what I mean by that is that when you look at Web 2 and Web 3, there's a fundamental difference. And the fundamental difference is Web 2 is read and write, and Web 3 is read, write, and own. So the ownership element is what makes the difference and the evolutions because these new concepts. So if we think the internet was big, purely built on read and write, I believe that Web 3 and read, write, and own is going to be exponentially bigger.
And I like that part of Snow Crash, no, because Snow Crash, and we're talking about marketing the metaverse, no, and it's all about telling stories. And if you actually see a couple of the lines in between between Snow Crash, you'll see how he talks about this world where there is this new subculture of people that can navigate into this metaverse and have access to infinite knowledge, no? And this gives them absolute power as a new elite that controls the framework of the discussion. I think Snow Crash Frames is a good way to start, no? And I like how you framed it. If we go now into more of a real life approach of the metaverse, no, we've seen Second Life. It's been there for quite some time. We've played with it before, no? How do you see it actually as a definition right now? Before we get into marketing, how would you frame the metaverse 2022, where we are right now?
Okay, thank you, Ronaldo. So basically, the metaverse, if we can define it in a quick way, it's a great promise that has been born in great hype, and I'll explain the two. Why is it a great promise? Because if you think about it, it could be the evolution of our social interaction. It could be the evolution not only of our digital life, but of our life, quote unquote, the whole thing. Because the way technology is going, the way social interaction is going, the way economic activity is going, it's all getting digitized. If now the metaverse is something that encapsulates all of this, and it's where we work, where we play, and where we learn, then that is the evolution of everything. This is the great promise. The hype part of it is a lot of things need to come into place for this reality to become something tangible. Right now, it is a promise at the most basic level. Okay, if we get a bit into what makes a metaverse, there's an underlying infrastructure. You know, I need networks, and it's not the 5G networks of today. They're not enough. Then I need a software layer, so there's blockchains and so on. These are critical, but still, we're in early days. Capacity, speed of transactions, security, and so on. That's still early. Next level, we need access devices. It's not the access devices of today. They overheat, they make you nauseous, the batteries die, but they're starting. Then we need marketplaces and creator tools. Those are already there. You can now go and create an entire metaverse through AI, but it's version 1.0. They're going to get better. But the building blocks are there. Then you go into experiences. So we've all heard the example, oh, I've watched a concert in Fortnite. That's not it. That's just one tiny little example that shows the promise. But I'll give you another example to counter it. In the UK, there was a football match that was streamed live, and it was a popular match. It broke almost the UK fiber infrastructure. This is a football match. So the metaverse is a promise of the entire world potentially being immersed in a digital world. We still need a long way to get there, but we're starting. So I don't want to sound like I don't believe in it. I do believe in it, and the promise is great. But we are at step one. So going back to marketing, if I'm a marketer, yes, I absolutely need to get in there. I need to understand it because it will redefine my consumer. It will redefine how my consumer wants to engage with me. It will redefine what my consumer thinks is authentic. To Hervé's point about ownership, yesterday we were having the discussion about ownership versus a brand's IP. How do I reconcile it? So there's a lot of interesting questions, but if you don't get in there now and start dabbling in it, then you might lose the plot.
No, and I like it. So we'll start here with saying when your digital self actually has more value or utility than your actual physical self. And here we're talking a little bit about having great promise, but also being overhyped, no? So we're still experimenting and infrastructure's not quite there. Technology's catching up, and this will be a great segue into marketing. But Carl, very important, from a technology standpoint, also from a democratization of access, where do you see the metaverse? Just to frame the punchline, no? To start leveling the playing field.
So I think the words I've used multiple times in different sort of contexts is it's a new immersive economic reality. That's how I'd look at it, right? And the reason why I say that is you've got to look at the future economy and what that's going to look like. And that future economy is being defined and shaped by Gen Z. That's the generation born after 1990. They're born into the internet age, and they are creating an internet age. They are playing and essentially living most of their life at a young age through that era. So what's going to happen over the next 10 years is they're going to become a majority of the income earners in the economy. By some estimates, $33 trillion of income will be earned through that generation. So what does that really mean? So if I'm a brand or a corporate, I need to be thinking, how am I going to communicate with this new consumer? And if I start to think of all of the ecosystem elements around a metaverse, there are pockets of very niche areas. So obviously VR and the immersive reality, high fidelity, low fidelity are going to play a role. Big dependency is obviously on infrastructure readiness, computational readiness, but don't underestimate that that world is evolving quite fast as well. And the reason why I say that is you just got to think about the effect of quantum computing in the future and what that's going to bring. That's essentially going to bring to life everything that we may be thinking about in the metaverse economy. Another attribute towards all of this is collaboration and partnerships. So you really got to start thinking more broadly about how you collaborate and how you partner to bring to life those immersive experiences which your consumer today is already assessing, but in the future will be demanding. That's how I look at it.
And I like it. Please.
Can I just add to this also one thing that needs to be thought about quite well, not only from a point of perspective of a marketer or of companies, but also of governments, is how do I enable this collaborative environment? How do I make it easy for companies and people with new ideas to actually experiment and create things? Because the metaverse comes at the confluence of metaverse. We're talking about Web3, we're talking about crypto. Some elements start touching on the regulation of the financial sector and so on. And it's very hard. How do you leave boundaries? How do you leave space for this experimentation, while at the same time worrying as a government about protecting your consumers and so on? So that's one thing we need to get into place. The other thing that Carl alluded to, which is very important, some companies, they portray the metaverse as one thing, my metaverse. And that's not where we should be headed. Where we should be headed is multiple quote-unquote metaverses, but that allow you as a consumer, and back to the ownership point, to be able to go from one to the other, have different identities, have different representations, just like today in real life. At work, we're one thing. At play, we're another. At home, we're one thing. With friends, we're another. Those human traits need to be able to transport into the metaverse.
And this gives me a segue to consumers, no? Because we're talking about marketing. And if we talk to the audience and we say CEOs, and there's a lot of information and data points that point out that CEOs are actually very, very focused on the legacy aspect and the potential of a metaverse. So they turn down to their CMOs, they go to their CIOs, to their C-suite teams, and it's like, this is relevant, this is important, we have to get into it, you know? And then there's this internal debate with C-suite teams, no, where they say, well, how am I going to approach this? Am I going to monetize? Is it going to be a return of learning experience? Am I going to engage with my consumers in this way or that way? And this will come for you, Herbie, this question, because we might not know a fixed definition of the metaverse, but all companies understand clients, they understand brand value, and they try to connect with their clients through stories. How does the metaverse help? Because I hear this quite a lot. No, we don't have marketing specialists in the metaverse. Yes, you don't, but you know marketing and you know your consumers, no? And it shouldn't be also that hard to approach. How do you see that?
Yeah, first I would say that everything that is new is scary. And you know, when you look at Web 2 in itself, we were talking about government regulations, etc. In Web 2, we haven't yet figured it out. You have the CEOs of the largest, U.S. Technology company that passed by Congress, and you see the debates that they're having with, a representative of the people, and you see that there's still a huge discrepancy going on about data privacy, about, interference within, the own democracies of the country itself. So, expecting that in Web 3 we're going to figure something that for the last 20 years we haven't figured out in Web 2 yet, where it's centralized, where you have CEOs, where you have companies, where you have entities to subpoena, and now all of a sudden we're saying, hey, this is Web 3, there's no company, there's no CEO, it's a network effect. It's very difficult to wrap your head around it. Especially with organizations where you arrive in the C-suites and people have been doing, follow the same career for 20 years, and all of a sudden we're saying there's a new game in town, and you have to go back to the drawing board. I understand that there's need to be a very strong education process that's go in this, and you add, high volatility. You read the news, and one day a company is gonna do something positive within that category, and the next day a company is saying, well, I don't believe in it anymore. I think that the first entry point is going to be about the education process, whether it's the CEOs or the rest of the people within the organization, and at the same time understanding that data has value. I think that this concept for the last, let's call it 15 years, I think consumers didn't realize that data had value. They said, if I get the product for free, they don't realize that they're the product. And people will say, I'll gladly give away all my data if I can log in the website for free. And what we're saying with Web3 and the metaverse itself is that attention spam has value, and at the same time, people can actually monetize what they're doing and have a peer-to-peer contribution to a project, an ecosystem, and a brand and an IP. So that evolution is, that transition is happening at the moment from a world of I, meaning I own the company, to a world of we, meaning our community actually owns the success of a project.
I think that's terribly important what you said, and I'm going to ask Carl for a little bit of color there. Here we talk about data, no? And data is important because we're talking about an era where we're actually leveraging in Web3 our own data, and a lot of companies are still not familiar with the concept of transforming your consumers into now stakeholders, no? And how that role is actually changing. And I think it's a pivotal change, no, to actually envision your consumer not only as something you target, but now enabling him by giving him and providing him value. No, and here data ownership takes into play a very relevant piece of the action. What are your comments regarding this shift of consumers to stakeholders and making them part of the process?
Yeah, I think it's very clear Web3 is all around community-driven engagement. And I think that kind of engagement is going to be leading most organizational transformation really as well. So bringing the consumer into the fold from a decision-making contribution process, concepts around decentralized autonomous organizations and the DAO structure within the Web3 space today, I think that's going to play a role in relation to how you become much more community guided, and I'd say driven in certain markets. So I think that's really important. The data itself, I think you got to think about is how is that being distributed? And so, today there's a reliance on centralized storage and where that sits and resides. But you could also argue there is some decentralized storage innovation that's happening. The likes of IPFS and how that's now coming into the fray. I think that's going to play quite an interesting role because there's an excessive amount of data that needs to be hosted, but it also needs to be efficiently distributed. But in terms of going back to the consumer, I think firstly, you got to think about how does the consumer get involved in shaping the strategy around the experience. So it's all personalization driven right now. If I think of, I guess, our kids, and if I think of just, my young son and my young daughter, they play Roblox, they play Fortnite, they already dress up their own avatars, they buy their own skins, they do all that, and I just look at my transaction on my credit card and say, geez, what happened there? But the point is that they're customizing and they're creating their own vision around their own, if you want to call it, closed metaverse environment that they're shaping. So if you take that as the lead, you can now immediately start to think, okay, we know from a mobile experience perspective, most of the fintechs here are trying to drive a personalization story and bring loyalty into that equation. I think there's a massive opportunity on loyalty. I think this is where the real opportunity lies in terms of touching and rewarding your consumer And we can talk later about NFTs and potentially how the certain models around that could work. But these are the various touch points that you've got to bring to the equation, right?
And I think fintech is extremely important, not that example or that parallel, because at the end of the day, I think the story that's still missing in Web3 is that you have to start with the consumer experience first and then try to work in that technology, you know? And this will come to you, Karim, because it feels like sometimes we're pushing in Web3 the technology, you know? And we're sometimes forgetting that the consumer, most of the times, they just want to be told beautiful stories, they want to be engaged, and if the technology works and makes it easier, great, and no, and that's how fintech tries to work. It's don't be overburdened with all these processes, just make it easy for you to transact, and it's just seamless, and you have that experience. Karim, in marketing, meta marketing as aggregation of data to take decisions has evolved, right? Because now you have stakeholders, you have data ownership, you have this new way of interact with consumers. How would you approach a project with a company that say that wants to dabble into the metaverse, and they're like, how am I going to begin this? Will I monetize? Will I just do a consumer experience? Do I go the Gucci way or the Walmart way? How would you actually approach this discussion?
Okay, I want to, before we get into that, Ronaldo, I just want to talk a little bit about the community. From a marketer's perspective, talking to communities is not new, right? That any good marketer has built their career on understanding that their audience or their consumers or their targets are not one, and there are different, you know, sometimes we call them target segments, sometimes we call them communities, sometimes we call them tribes, whatever. So that already exists as a concept. What the technology is doing is giving you a lot more information about them, but also we need to realize today marketers have a lot more information about consumers, and honestly, most of them don't know how to use it. And you've seen sort of the backlash against targeted advertising in Web 2.0, and how at some point, I think it was Procter & Gamble who said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. We've given up on it, and they've basically abandoned the fight. But others got into it to the point where they could do niche targeting, and they could figure it's not the same for everyone. So just because the data is there in the metaverse doesn't mean that everybody needs to be using every single piece of data. The concept of data privacy, data ownership is also not new. Today we have GDPR, we have all sorts of government intervention. It's just that in the metaverse it becomes more of an issue, because now it's not only data about your activities, it's also your identity, who you are, how you represent yourself, what you're doing, who you talk to, what sort of things you buy. That's becoming, there's a lot more info. So again, we have to protect from abuse of this data. So to go back to your question, look, the cynical side of marketers would say, okay, maybe we think of metaverse today like streaming was a buzzword in media, for those of you familiar with the media world. So a few years ago, anybody who was in the media business had to say the word streaming on their earnings call, so that everybody says, these guys get the future of media. They had no clue what the heck streaming was. They had no idea how it impacts their business, but they had to say it. We've just gone through this phase with the metaverse. Every single earnings call, every CEO has to say metaverse. And doesn't mean doesn't matter if there's a plan behind it or if there's actually real intent. So we started with that stage. The CEO said metaverse on the earnings call. They turned to their CMO and said, I said metaverse on the earnings call. Do something about it. CMO was like, what the heck is this metaverse thing? I have no idea. Talks to his agency, depending who his agency is probably, or maybe somebody approaches him or her, and he says, okay, let's do it. So the fear of all this new stuff then comes in. So then you start, we've seen different stages. The first stage is replicate. Like there was a press release a couple of days ago. I won't name the company just in case they end up being a client, but they were very proud that they created a billboard in the metaverse. Wow, a billboard in the metaverse. We hate billboards in real life, right? Why would I go and replicate a bad experience in real life in the metaverse? But that's the familiar. That gets over the fear. That gets them to dabble. They understand what this is. Okay, I understand what a billboard is. You're giving me a virtual version of it, and people are passing by it in the metaverse. Okay, I get it. That's step one. Step two is integrate. They figure out that there are other players, there are platforms, there's a Roblox, there's a whatever, and they can build a world for you. They can incorporate you into a community that already exists. So like, okay, I want my brand in there. You've figured out this whole metaverse thing. Take my brand and let's design something together. So then they build a Gucci world or a Nike world or whatever. And then where we all want to get to is the innovate bit, because that's where you're now comfortable, you're not afraid anymore, you understand how this whole thing works. Most importantly, as a CMO, you understand that nobody else has the answer either. Everybody's experimenting, right, at all levels. Right? And that's where you start coming up with new things. That's where an Nike and an artifact combination comes in, and we start thinking, what is the definition of a shoe? In the metaverse, it's something completely different. That's where we start saying, what is the definition of fashion in the metaverse? It's completely different. So, and you've seen it in retail. They go from, okay, I have a store, I want the exact store in the metaverse. That's stage one. So we're going through this evolution, but I think we need to give CMOs and marketers time to go through this journey.
I love it, I love it, because first you actually kill the fear, then you start going a little bit and start testing the waters, and then you truly innovate and disrupt. And it seems like it's planned because you're giving me a great segue. So Hervé, or Hervé, because you said Alexandra said it perfectly, he's an OG in the Bitcoin industry. He started mining very, very early. He got into all the projects for the traditional reasons we dabble into Web3. And you're currently in the council of probably the largest project of the metaverse right now in the Other Side Guild. No, it's a completely different metaverse play. It does not have to do with brands. It's a project that was incubated from a community, an OG community like the Bored Apes. No, it created its own market. It created its own disruption. It's now the largest play with over 200,000 land plots. No, and you still don't know what's going to happen, but you know there's going to be a lot of value creation, and it's pushing now, I don't know, a $4 billion valuation. How does that reconcile with a more traditional company that's, like Kareem said, no, the Nikes, the large companies are trying to figure out their play, but we have on the other side of the aisle this incredible disruption happening within communities, and they're creating their own ecosystems and saying, we don't need the brands, we'll create our own IP, and with our own IP, we'll start creating money, value, and we'll drive it through gaming experience. Can you give some light that? Because that's another completely way of doing marketing, no?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of layers in this. I would say that three thoughts. The first one is that the reason why companies are getting in the metaverse, and let's call it for the wrong reasons, is that there's need to be growth relays. And when you look in even traditional asset classes, there's no growth in the stock market. There's no growth in real estate market. So you need to find a category that can outperform the rest of the industries. And that category, historically, for the last 20 years, has been technology, who's been beating inflation, because at the end today, if you don't make over 10%, you're not beating inflation, so might as well not doing anything. And when you look at the business model of Web3, you have what we call Metcalfe's law and exponential growth. So you figure that, instead of going towards a linear business, which is the way that, we're used to learn in business school how to value companies, now all of a sudden you have network effects that can drastically outperform, and obviously Bitcoin was the perfect history. Despite the up and downs, it has been, over a long period of time, a very strong growth. In terms of the metaverse itself, I believe that, companies don't have to go in the metaverse. The same ways that, I was presenting Web3 to probably one of the largest luxury brands in the world, and they said, we don't do e-commerce. Our website, we just show our products. We can't even satisfy the demand. We never needed to go into Web 2. And, for us, it's, it's interesting intellectually, but we don't need to be in that space. So I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is that it can't be everything for everyone. And I think picking a vertical and sticking with it was the success of some of the communities that I've been involved with. And when you look at the development of the metaverse, they're not trying to be, billboards. They're not trying to be an e-commerce platform. They're not trying to be many things just to cater to the existing market. What they are trying to do is to listen to their community and see what they want. And their community is relatively small in the grand scheme of things. When you hear, Web2 having millions of consumers, they're just listening to their 10,000 members and say, hey guys, put a proposal out there. So they're basically put a question out. And right now I'm special counsel for one of these large projects, and we receive questions from the community. We decide, is it a valid question or not, and then you put it out for vote. So we're basically not even having authority over what is happening. We're just making sure that there's actually a process, and there's a big say about the aspect of crowdfunding. When you listen to in that case, let's call them consumers that have a financial incentive through the token that is being created, and who are actually going to put their attention span on this project, why not asking them what they want to do? So we're often trying to guess, and in my previous career, I was part of the largest luxury groups in the world, and a lot of the time, we're guessing, what the consumer wants. And all of a sudden, in Web3, I'm like, well, let's not guess, let's just ask them. And I think that in some way facilitates a lot of the discussions. And I would finish by saying that there was something that I was always really amazed, is the transparency of the Web3 community. So, in the mining space, people will, look at, every single number and says, here there's more electricity being used. But the reality is that in traditional business, we don't have a clue what electricity is being used. The only difference here is that it's being transparent and saying, hey, how can we improve and how can we have less electricity consumptions? That's the only difference between the two systems. And on the metaverse that you mentioned, there's also the fact that why don't we iterate using the community? So in traditional Web2 video games, you launch it when the product is final. Here you're basically saying, hey guys, we're in the alpha version. Why don't we all meet up, try the platform, give me your feedback, see if it works, and then let's continue to evolve. So even if the product is average, the fact that I've been involved in the development of it, all of a sudden I feel that it's mine, and I'm gonna, fight tooth and nail to make sure that this project becomes successful over time.
I think you touched some important points, very important in terms of valuation, testing. Let's call it that fail methodology, that first attempt of learning, which I think replicates a lot. We were talking about that, Carl. I think when we talk about valuations, we're seeing this next hype of projects now coming in with a great idea that's very highly marketable, very attractive, and they're going at astonishing valuations, raising incredible amounts of money, but sometimes the business economics are not there, and we're talking about how a lot of projects just fail miserably, and the community feels rugged, because you're raising the expectations of a dream that's not yet created, and you're not delivering on the promise, And then we're seeing, as you mentioned, and I would like you to talk a little bit about that, that buy now, pay later schemes, and how they're not necessarily, they're hyping in a model that does not necessarily sustain economically grounded, And then you see a model like the one Hervé is talking about, where they're actually doing rapid prototyping, but at the same time, using the community as pilot testing programs, but they're funding the project. So it's a weird way of bootstrapping, because through an NFT collection, you're bootstrapping capital, you're doing alphas and betas, and you're actually asking them to improve it for you. What are your thoughts there? And talking about fintech and what we talk about valuations.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously lived the fintech life quite a bit. And that's ex-Visa, and I do a lot of advisory work with fintechs. But if you think about the similarities, this is probably more important. So there is a try now, fail later concept, but there is also the concept of what we're seeing in Web3, which is, yes, as you said, community engagement, helping shape and define the MVP of that, whether it's a play-to-earn game or whatever it may be, a move-to-earn or any other concept, and getting that involvement from the ground up and then shaping as required. But in some cases, we're seeing now there's a correction in the market, and that correction is having a huge impact on utility value projects versus non-utility value projects. So, don't know what that's about. You guys can hear me. So on the BNPL space, I mean, yes, we've seen a very big correction around how the profitability of buy now, pay later platforms are being tested and being challenged. And the reason for that is their model was built around user uptake and getting the consumers on board, and then essentially signing up merchants to add value within that ecosystem for certain consumers, millennials and sort of above. But when you think about how they've been judged and how the Web3 market's been judged, you could argue probably not as similar in terms of the way they've been judged. Buy now, pay later schemes around the world have gone through a significant correction, even in the stock markets. If you think of the equity markets in Australia, there's a couple of those players that have reached a certain high about 6 or 7 months ago. They're down below 90% of where their market valuation is now. The same applies in the Web3 space. So when you're looking at it both, one is regulated heavily, certainly as a financial services regulatory authorities around the world. The other, in our world, is not as regulated. So you could argue, well, which one of those is really being put to the test? I would rather be probably in the camp of my community and my stakeholders being heavily involved in shaping my journey than probably in the camp where there isn't as much involvement from the shareholders rather than just owning some equity. And I think maybe that'll start to change over time. But I think this is where, if I was a fintech, I'd start to think of things differently. I'll start to think of, well, it's not necessarily all about the metaverse, and it's not necessarily being present there, but it's around what is the approach to having a metaverse economic model that I can utilize, and what are those key areas there that can add value into my business. And whether I'm a fintech or I'm a Web3 entity focusing on maybe providing some kind of a utility value in the metaverse, I still need to think about those areas which help me shape my journey rather than just being judged on, let's just say, my current valuation and not having any stakeholder input from the shareholders in that regard.
Yeah, I want to just talk a little bit because from the marketer's perspective, because if I don't know how many people in the audience understood every single buzzword we've thrown at you. Probably there isn't a single one unless you work with one of the companies. So this is the same for every marketing department or brand, right? You don't have to have a crystal ball as a marketing department, and you're not supposed to figure out where is the future and what is the metaverse going to be, and is it this startup that's going to succeed or that platform. That's not your job, and that's the job of the market and the dynamics of funding and users and whatever. From a marketing perspective, it's still the basics. You have to figure out, what is my brand about? How do I want to connect with my consumers? Okay, let me look at the options that are under the label metaverse today. Which of these am I comfortable associating with? And then place multiple bets effectively, right? And you can't place an indefinite number of bets, so you have to prioritize. So that's one thing. I don't think we need to expect our marketing departments or marketing teams or chief metaverse officers, whatever the label is going to be, to suddenly become also technology experts and finance experts and economics experts and virtual reality, whatever. Fine. On Hervé's point about you don't have to get into the metaverse. In a sense, yes, you could. Like, if you have your demand far exceeds your supply. But basically today, what is the metaverse today? It's a rebrand of online gamers, effectively, if we're going to be realistic about it. But it's evolving extremely quickly. And the gamers, they're not all young. Some of them already are in their 30s and they already have money. But this generation, a lot of them are young. This generation that are today the ones who are spearheading this shift to the digital presence are going to be the ones where economic power is concentrated over the next 20, 30 years. So if you're a brand that wants to continue having revenue, that wants to continue to stay relevant, you need to not stray too far away from them. Maybe you're not monetizing them today because they're not your target audience, maybe they're younger, but if you just leave them completely and wait until they're older and then they fit your definition of my customer or my consumer and then decide to get in, you might then be irrelevant to them because they haven't seen you as they grew up into that.
So, and here comes now a question, not that much of a wrap up, but a little bit, Karim, and I would like to start with that because you opened the door. If you could summarize, let's say the audience is all CMOs. And the question is, should I hire this $1.2 million metaverse director? Or should I just go with my team and try to upskill? What would be your 3 key recommendations to a CMO that's trying to right now answer those questions? Should I do it? How? When?
Sure.
Why should I do it? Which sometimes is the most important question, no? Why do I want a metaverse? What would be the 3 points?
The why, we go back to what we just said. You need to do it if you want, as a long-term play, to remain relevant, right? That's one. The how, look, metaverse today is what in the beginning of digital was happening. In the beginning of digital, for those of you old enough to remember, everybody created digital offices, and it's like, you know, this new thing called digital, let's create a department for it and stick it on the side of the org chart, and they have to worry about it, and we'll just go on pretending nothing has changed and live our lives like everything's okay. And then pretty much they figured out a few years down the road that everything has become digital and that it's not one person, everyone, it's in everybody's job. And so we shift. There are still digital officers today, but their job has changed, right? Today, if you're a CEO and you don't understand digital, you're not a CEO, right? Your company's tanking. The same is with Metaverse. Today, the inclination is let's dump it in some corner and call somebody Chief Metaverse Officer. Over time, this will not be the right strategy. So what I would recommend is make sure 2 things. One, within your team, you actually have people who understand it, which means they might not be your current team. But it doesn't mean your current team is useless because they still need to figure out the 95% of everything else that's happening in your world that has nothing to do with Metaverse today.
Correct.
So that's 1 in your team. And 2, in your partners. You know, everyone's comfortable with the agencies and the partners and the creatives and whatever that they work with. Do that sanity check. Do they get it? And if they don't get it, you have to change them. That's easier than changing. So bring in capability into your team because that learning has to be part of the entire team's experience. And you also have to extend this learning to the other parts of the organization because in the end, product will be impacted by Metaverse. You know, admin is going to be impacted by the Metaverse. Supply chain is going to be impacted by the Metaverse. Right? So the whole organization needs to take this learning. You're just spearheading it. So bring the learning in, spread it to the rest of the organization so they get it, and make sure that your partners that you're working with also get it and have the capability.
I like it. I'm going to summarize it, and I take the three points I take is 1, you have to gradually upskill, and if you can't, you have to bring in talents. So that's stage 1, but you have to keep your base of operations relevant. There's something you have to socialize within the organization. There has to be some sort of you have to evangelize within as well to socialize this, and you have to work with your partner network, which might not be there, and you have to associate kind of a little bit about you're an average of the 5 people you hang out with most of your time. If you're hanging out with people that don't understand this, you might be in a circle that does not allow you to actually far extend, no?
And Ronaldo, there is where, as a larger company, you might not be comfortable because you're used to working with big brands. You know, it's like buying IBM in the 60s. I went with this big agency because they're global 3, and nobody can ever blame me for working with them. They might not be necessarily the right people. Some of them are, some of them are not. Maybe here you have to take risks and work with smaller partners who are in the early stages of trying to come up with new ideas and change the mix of the partners that you have.
What about you, Hervé? What are your 3 takeaways here? How do we actually bring this into consumers' markets? What would be the recommendations for a CMO, CIO, even a CTO? Because sometimes the lines are a little bit blurry, you know? It's not only the CMO's fault here, and sometimes it's, you know, you're the innovation officer. I just take care of the pricing and the sales here and the strategy. What are you going to do with this in innovation? No, the lines are blurry. What would be your recommendations there?
So I would look at history, and let's look at the transition between Web 1 and Web 2. does the famous stories between the Netflix and the Blockbuster and the Walmart and Amazon, and I would say companies right now, if they had to start today, how they would disrupt their own business, if they don't think about their current corporate governance, shareholders structure, and they say, hey, we start with a blank page. How do we actually approach it? Do we become Web3 native from day one? We mentioned Artifact and Nike. Artifact was a Web3 company, and they got purchased by our large conglomerates. Yeah, so there's some businesses that would have a natural evolution to transition from Web 2 to Web 3. You would have businesses that just can't. The label Metaverse is not going to be applicable to them. Sure, they can get a press release right now and can make their board and their shareholder happy for a period of time. But I would say for me, the most interesting story that I've looked at was actually a traditional Web 2 company, a guy who owned 100% of the business, who basically started the same business in Web 3. And he could do that because he had nobody to report on. So I would say to look at the business and think about it from an entrepreneurial standpoint, and how do actually, does it make sense to actually jump on that new frontier right away?
So what I would take as recommendations, just from extracting a little bit of that, I would say sometimes you have to assess external capacity also as small regional players. No, as a large corporation, you can actually assess and say, maybe this company is good enough for me to actually incorporate, whether, as Karim said, it's a matter of partnership, or it's simply an acquisition and you actually bring in that innovation in. Another is just pivoting, no? This capacity to actually have an entrepreneurial mindset to actually say, I have this product and it's working in a Web 2 environment. How would I tropicalize this vision to cater to new consumers? And the third one for me would be assessing if it's the right time for you. Because sometimes it might not be the right time and you might not need to actually be diverting a lot of efforts when your actual pivotal strategy is not there. No, it's actually not part of your underlying corporate DNA. And it might be that it's not suit for everyone. No, so I'm taking those three nuggets, so to speak. Carl, last but not least, what are those three? And I would like also a little bit of an economic standpoint here. Now, what are those three recommendations for a CMO? And also because the Visa background that you have, what are the three key points or nuggets that we can take in this marketing experience of the Metaverse for a CMO?
So I think firstly, just to cover off some of the points that Karim and Herb were talking about, the concept of a chief innovation officer and the roles and responsibility that they had within organizations, we saw how that play out. I mean, in some cases, a lot of cases, the execution side wasn't really supported because the KPI metric within an organization wasn't supportive of that. What I would argue is you want most of your staff, and I use this approach, which is you need to have a change mindset, you need to possess an entrepreneurial spirit, and you need to carry an innovation DNA. These are the three ingredients. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I spoke a lot publicly about this in the past. Having a change mindset is not about expecting change. It's about embracing change. And when you can see change happening, as we're seeing right now in the metaverse economy that's being defined and shaped by a younger generation, younger than we've ever had before, probably in the history of economics, you can start to see the Gen Z effect. So I would be preparing for that immediately. That's the first thing. And that means us as individuals, whether we're Gen X, millennials, whatever, we need to understand that area. We need to then start to shape as an organization towards that journey. So that is an embracing change. Number two, an entrepreneurial mindset and spirit is very key. So if I think of all of the startups here, fintechs, whatever, at the end of the day, they're at various stages of their growth cycle. And they require, whether they're the founders or whether they're investors or whether they're staff, they need to think about continuous collaboration and partnering. And you need to partner with an ecosystem that's evolving around you. And that means me as an individual, whether I'm a marketing head or whether I'm an engineer defining code in the background or whether I'm a procurement head. it doesn't matter. I need to be out there, coming to these type of events and embracing with the ecosystem and seeing what are those nuggets that can add value to what we're trying to achieve. That's sort of really important, because the founder of a startup and a CEO of a large corporate, whether it's Visa or Microsoft or any other company, have a same approach to the way they're being measured. They're accountable to shareholders and investors, and they're continuously looking and hunting for new partnerships in business. The third ingredient is probably the most important, is carrying an innovation DNA. Every day, what we do is we wake up and we solve problems as human beings. So if we're looking to solve a problem, we should be thinking about approaching a problem relative to our current, whether it's a product or service we're offering in the market to our clients, or some innovative strategy or idea that we can put into a list which is accountable within the organization and then help across that journey to solve that problem. So, you know, I wake up in the morning, I may not have toothpaste, I got to solve that. I got to order online. I need to get to Jitex this morning. I got to solve the navigation of getting here. When I'm here, I'm collaborating. Now I'm actually solving a different problem. How do we help build the metaverse economy, which is coming? And so I look at all of those things together, combined, and whether you want to call that individual or business unit or the organization, should be shaping itself around it.
I love it. This opens the floor to another hour of discussion, which we don't have, which is actually, you touched so important points, Carl, because the next conversation of a CMO might be like, yes, I'm part of this great organization, and I need to have entrepreneurial mindset. I have to have this capacity to innovate within my divisions and my organizations, and I have to be able to adapt and have this capacity. But how do I navigate the organizational resistance that can happen within regulatory frameworks within an organization? Or how do I navigate cross-jealousy that can happen in very large organizations within different departments? And how do I actually socialize a strategy that might be very complex in terms of liabilities? Should I actually just go and do it completely outside? Should I go with a partner that can actually do it for me? Should I actually invest in gradually upskilling talent? No, those are questions that a lot of the CMOs are framing. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. If I can just summarize this up a little bit, what I'm seeing is, or hearing and taking from different mindsets, is that we are experiencing something that has great potential. The infrastructure is not quite there. It's giving us this capacity to innovate and create new communities and build completely new standards that do not exist in the traditional economy, but it's also grounded on the necessity of actually having factual grounding of economic variables that are just key metrics that any business needs to have, right? And it's not necessarily about just going and hiring today a new team of $3 million tomorrow and trying to implement. It's about gradually understanding your structural DNA as a company, where your limits are, and gradually pushing that change, no? It makes me think of about this disruption. I always love quotes, no? And I was going to say a quote about, when you talk about real estate, I was going to just jump and say about Mark Twain about real estate, no? Saying you should invest there because they're not making more of it. But the true quote that comes into my mind is about change, no? And I can't help but think about Yevgeny Zamyatin, no? That said that, and I'm paraphrasing it, he talked about literature, but he said that true change, like true structural change, has to be created and has to be disrupted. And it's not going to be by stable bureaucrats or just people going along. It's going to be made by disruptors, hermits, agnostics. It's going to be met by madmen and by poets, no? And I think every organization needs to have this diversity of profiles to actually push the boundaries of organizations. And I think marketing is that, no? It's talking to your consumers, it's understanding your communities and taking from there as much as you can. And at the end of the day, it's an experimentation phase where we're not going to hit the crystal ball, no? But at the end of the day, I think we're going to move forward, and technology is bringing us these beautiful new drivers that allowed us to create this novel environment. So I appreciate you being here on this panel for us. We did it 4 minutes over time, so I think Jitex will be proud, no? And I thank you very much for your time, and I don't think we even have time for questions. Or do we have time for questions? We don't. My apologies. Perfect. Thank you very much.